Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Alina Rocha Menocal, and I am the director of the Thinking and Working Politically Community of Practice. For the March 2026 edition of our newsletter, I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Liam O'Shea, who is a specialist in security sector reform, anti-corruption, and the politics of institutional change, and he has particular geographic expertise on Eurasia. I am speaking with Liam today because he has recently completed a project for the Serious Organized Crime and Anti-Corruption Evidence Research Program, which is based at the University of Birmingham. And as part of that program, he was looking at what reforms have been more or less effective at reducing police and military involvement in organized crime. And he is also the founder of the Anti-Corruption and Building Integrity in Defense and Security Network, which is a community that brings together donors and independent experts to develop politically grounded strategies for security sector integrity. Liam has previously held positions as governance advisor at the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO, as a senior research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, and at the London School of Economics. He now runs Security, Governance, Integrity, or SGI for short, research, which is a specialist consultancy providing research and advisory services on security, governance, and integrity, as the name would suggest. So, Liam, warm welcome to you. I'm so glad that you're able to join us.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. That was a lovely intro too.
Amazing. All good. So I have a few different questions for you, drawing, of course, on the research that you have done for Showcase and also things related to that. But maybe for a starting point, we can start with the big picture question for the benefit of our listeners. So could you tell us a little bit more about what security sector reform entails and why it is important to understand the security sector from a broader governance and politically informed perspective?
Sure, I'd be delighted to. Just before we start, I should point out that our project was a collaborative effort. There were three other authors there, and we had to draw on their expertise too. But yeah, security sector reform. Well, I can tell you what it is meant to be and what it is in practice, right? So. It kind of came out of the 90s, really. Essentially, Western powers had intervened in a lot of places, Kosovo, Bosnia, Sierra Leone. And our concept is essentially that to have development, you need to have security, and to have security, you need to have a functioning security sector. So the concept came out there and largely has been based around what we need to do. And it's usually around the end point of we need to reform security sectors, mainly so they look like an ideal type Western security sector. So it's effective, it's efficient, there's oversight, there's accountability, and so on and so forth. And these are important things, and it is really important that security institutions have this oversight and accountability, because that helps them be effective. But that is kind of the ideal of SSR. And I don't think it's ever actually really being realized. So once we move on into the 2000s and we have Iraq and Afghanistan, you look back and think, not so very successful. And one of the reasons is that SSR, I don't think, has really been holistically ever achieved. So we still use the discourse of it being very, very holistic and inclusive and involving this these broader sets of reforms to achieve stability, security, and contribute to broader governance reforms. But in reality, under the label of SSR, you often get train and equip, a bit of piecemeal reform here or there. So there's a bit of a differentiation between what SSR is in theory and how it's worked out in practice.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jamie. It actually sounds a lot like other development efforts where there's an ideal sort of state of where things ought to get to or what they ought to look like without necessarily thinking how they work in actual practice and what derives from that in terms of what can be done going forward. So let us perhaps now delve into the project that you led for SOCASE, and I fully appreciate that it's a collaborative effort. And in fact, you also very kindly have written a blog for us that we are featuring in our newsletter, and we're also including a link to the report itself, which includes, of course, you and your co-authors. But before we delve into the findings and key messages that emerged from that report, can you tell us a little bit more what collusion means? I mean, there's obviously something about the involvement of the police and the military involved in organized crime, but can you tell us a little bit more about what this looks like and why it is such a serious challenge for how states and societies function?
Yeah, sure. I mean, broadly, there are two types, right? There is police colluding with organized criminals, and that can take various different forms. So there's almost like at lower level, you might have a few officers who can be paid off to, I don't know, hide evidence or find information, to transport weaponry, to inform on their proceedings. And it can go up a level too, where police are, actually collaborating with organized criminals, perhaps over racketeering or networks, over operations and criminal enterprises themselves. So that's kind of one part where they're collaborating. The other part, and maybe collusion might not be the best word, is basically the police are doing it by themselves, right? So the police are essentially, say, a racketeering group. So I've lived in Russia. Interestingly, they had a phrase there. They called them wolves in epaulets, which I think is quite apt.
The wolves in epaulets?
Well, wolves in epaulets. Was it Volki v Pagonach? And yeah, I mean that tells you it all. And the thing about why is this important? I mean, I find that it's quite interesting because I often get asked sort of that by sort of usually donors, why is this an important issue? And I think it's quite self-evident, to be honest with you. Like if the people who are meant to be upholding public security are literally stealing from the population and robbing them and beating them up for criminal purposes, that's a massive problem. And it's not just a massive problem, it is, I don't know what it's like in every country, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's the norm in a majority of countries in the world. And again, it takes different shapes. You get petty bribery at the bottom, where police stop you at a roadblock and maybe ask you for tea or just take $50 or $20, and it goes up. It goes up to more serious stuff. And it's quite noticeable that when I go to non-Western countries and I say, oh, I'm looking at the police, the first thing that people say is, oh, they're so corrupt. Not everywhere, and it's not black and white. West is good, certainly not these days. And the developing countries are bad. There are degrees of graduation. But I think it's really important, particularly for Westerners, to get out the mindset that the police are actually doing what they expect them to. Now, I grew up in the 1980s in the UK, and the school police came into school, and we were taught that the police were nice, and if you were in trouble, go to the police. Don't do that in other countries. And the final thing I'd say to that is, there's loads of ways about measuring police, and we don't need to get into that. But I remember one thing that a scholar told me, which I think was quite telling, was probably the best metric of whether the police are doing what they were doing is, would parents tell their children to go to a police officer if they're in trouble? And I wonder if we did a survey across the world, how many countries that would apply to.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting because I am myself from Mexico and I have a very different relationship to the police than my kids do here, having grown up being born and raised in London. So when I'm a bit skeptical of the police approaching us, they're much more welcoming. So it's actually, you're right on that front. Would you be
And
able
also,
to?
it's not just about, I mean, I'm white and middle class, right? So,
Yeah.
so I have a certain relationship with the police in this country, but if I came from a different demographic, I may not. But anyway, yeah, you get my point.
Absolutely. So I want to hear a little bit about your research, your findings, the kinds of questions that frame the study and all of this. But I wonder, for now, you chose Colombia, Georgia, and South Africa as the three cases for the study. And I'm wondering, could you tell us a little bit about why you chose those three and what this collusion issue looked like, sort of from an overarching perspective in Colombia, in Georgia, in South Africa? Is there something particular and peculiar to what collusion looked like in each of these countries, or was it similar? Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. I mean, the main thing, I'm really interested in success cases. And I have a little bugbear about a lot of researchers. Either it focuses on problems, and particularly in international development, everyone assesses programs but if you're assessing lots of programs, you're only really dealing at a very limited level. So I like case studies and then looking at what led to change, then working backwards. And so I was interested. So Georgia, I knew because I did my PhD on police reform in Georgia, and then one of my collaborators, Louis Alexander Berg, he suggested Colombia. He's written a great book on governing insecurity after conflict. Alexander Kupatate could also help on Georgia, and Lucia Tiscornia, she's done lots of research on South Africa. So we actually ended up having two broadly success cases of Colombia and Georgia, and then a not successful case in South Africa. And we also wanted some geographical spread. Africa was the most difficult anyway. But yeah, I was interested in the success cases, and then the approach then was going to be, okay, what broad set of factors, so at an organizational level, an institutional level, and a political level, led to relative successes, and why not in South Africa? And I think that's different than doing that kind of program evaluation, because you're only really looking at what the program does. I mean, even if you look at lots of them, your lens is too narrow. So by looking at the bigger picture and then being able to distill that, the idea is that we can then say to donors, for example, or governments, this is what needs to happen for change to happen at, say, an organizational level, but also what needs to be in place for, say, organizational change to happen, so that they can be more catalytic. You asked, collusion. What was the shape of it?
Yes, if you can elaborate a little bit on what collusion looked like in Colombia versus Georgia versus South Africa. I mean, it may have been consistent across the board, but you said earlier that it can be something as sort of relatively trivial as having tea versus, having an
Yeah.
entire police apparatus corrupted and involved in organized crime themselves.
Yeah, and there's sort of commonalities but different flavors. So Georgia's the case I know the best. I mean, Georgia before 2003 was a complete mess. It was almost a failed state under President Edward Shevardnadze. I mean, police were running casinos and brothels and doing arms. I remember I did an interview in Georgia where someone told me the policeman was sitting on a stool at a roadblock, huge policeman, and he had a stick with a magnet on the end, and he was too lazy to go into the car and do a subtle bribe. He just said, throw the coins into a basket and he'd pick it up with the magnet. So it was that brazen. That's how things worked. And then you also have, in Georgia, there's organized criminals had a lot of prominence in power and society, a bit sort of like the Sicilian mafia in the bad days. So, and they of course influenced the police. So there was a lot and politics. Colombia was slightly different, but some similar features. I mean, you've got probably one of the main differences is just the size of the narco economy and how it had grown, and you have prominent actors like, I mean, Pablo Escobar, right, elected to parliament, right, and then other, less big as him, but again influencing politics at local government and national government, but also infiltrating the police and some of the units there. South Africa, slightly different, but I mean, the main issue in South Africa, which prior to apartheid, the transition was, of course, apartheid and racial policing. But an element of that which is less well known is that police were involved in organized crime networks as well. I think in drugs, around like racketeering around nightclubs. So there's some different features, but the most common one is that there was police involvement in organised crime, and also levels of corruption throughout all three.
Great, thank you so much. That's very helpful. I wonder if I can ask you something around how it is possible to research collusion. How I assume this is not an easy topic to tackle, and especially can be quite politically sensitive. So how do you, as a researcher and with your research team, how did you approach this question? How could you sort of investigate what collusion looks like in these different settings, being mindful of the risks involved?
In a sense, this project, it wasn't too difficult because we were looking at reforms that had happened quite some time ago and two successful cases. Like governments like to talk about when they've been successful. So that wasn't too difficult in that sense. But more broadly, yeah, I've lived in Russia and been asking questions in Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, and Russia and other places. And I think it depends on what level you want to get in at. If you're looking at the landscape and the country is relatively open, it's not too difficult. You can talk to civil society. You can usually find some police who might talk to you off the record, or ex-police. But there's a difference between doing that and doing kind of investigative journalism. And I research other forms of illicit activity as well. And the same usually applies. If you're talking at a broad level, you can get enough people to talk to build up cases, and then be able to talk about the patterns. So I often talk to investigative journalists, like I say, civil society, and ex-law enforcement. It does get tricky, of course, when you're working on, say, either a very sensitive issue at the time, and you've got to be very, very careful as a researcher, particularly of endangering your sources.
Thanks so much. So now we can delve a little bit into the actual findings from your study. And just briefly to say, having read the report and also the really nice blog that you have very kindly written for us, obviously you showcase Colombia and Georgia as more successful examples than South Africa. And I was wondering, could you tell us what the key factors were in Colombia and Georgia versus South Africa that led to a different outcome? And also, could you highlight how context and especially politics were relevant in those outcomes?
Sure. Well, let me start with the impact of the reforms. So the reforms were not all targeted at collusion. We looked at just reforms, big security reforms, and what happened. And that's a major reason for the different outcomes, but I'll come to that. But yeah, let me talk a little bit about success, right? So we mainly focused on what led to, well, could we see and what led to reductions in collusion. Now that's a bit different from SSR. SSR is very, very broad and general, and involves governance, accountability, efficiency, so on and so forth. But the reason we focus on this is unless you can deal with collusion, you can't deal with the other stuff, right? You can't have an effective police or a nice police if they're robbing people, as discussed. So although this is a narrower focus, I think it's a really important one. I think collusion, corruption are like first order priorities.
Yeah.
And they did deal with them in Colombia and Georgia well, quite considerably. I mean, but they still had problems like around police brutality, certain levels of lower level corruption, but particularly around brutality and accountability. But the transition, for example, in Georgia between the failed state that I'd supplied to a reasonably okay police force in 6 months, a year, is pretty off the record. And Colombia, over time, also had a quite effective narco economy to police that are under the state's control, and yeah, so quite impressive. But what led to that? Well, let me talk about the reforms and then the politics. So the reforms, well, what was, first of all, Georgia and Colombia explicitly targeted collusion. South Africa didn't. So South Africa, like I said, the reforms are mainly about democratic policing, overcoming the racialized structure of policing. In Georgia, by contrast, they really, corruption and tackling organized crime. Organized crime was seen as a societal problem by this new government that came into power. And so they explicitly targeted organized crime and collusion. And the same in Colombia. And that practically meant things like each country introduced specialized anti-organized crime legislation. So they modeled it on, say, US and Italian legislation, and that did things like it made it easier to prosecute organized crime as well as collusion. So it's just to give you a very little example of that. This kind of legislation might make it easier to tackle conspiracy, make it illegal, conspiracy illegal. So instead of having to nail a crime on Don O'Shea, you could see, Don O'Shea has been involved in conspiracy, so and that then we could prosecute Don O'Shea along those lines. And they also did other elements of the reforms, like they did purges, right? That's a major thing which SSR largely ignores. But the Georgians fired about 10,000 police. Over time, the Colombians did something quite similar. Another key factor was they introduced leaderships, reform leaders within the police organizations and the military in Colombia as well, which we covered. And that was really important because you can't really expect corrupt police leaders to be very good at leading anti-corruption reforms. And so you needed those powerful people at an organizational level who were able to remove and get rid of people to really kind of get hold of their organizations. Another key element of the reform was the combination of organizational reform, and by organization I mean like police military organization, and then creating these in specialized prosecutorial bodies with powers to investigate and prosecute organized crime. So, and these weren't necessarily huge units, but they did have that. They could investigate organized crime, and including collusion, and they can actually prosecute, and people were prosecuted. And that's important because it gives teeth to the reforms. So again, this is something that's often lacking, particularly in externally led or promoted reforms, is that you need to do this, X, Y, and Z, and if you don't do it, there aren't any repercussions really. Whereas in Georgia and Colombia, here are the new rules, and police were fired. Police were fired. They were put in prison, and so it was really, it was dealt with. Let me talk a little bit about the politics though, because this didn't happen in a vacuum. So one of the other reasons we chose our three countries, well, actually, all three sets of reforms happened after political openings of some sort. So, breakdown of apartheid in South Africa and then the transitional regime. There was a revolution in Georgia. I mean, it wasn't like the French Revolution, but it was still a kind of a popular / elite level uprising, but it removed the old regime, and a new government came in, young, many of them were Western educated, and so that created an opportunity to push through reforms. Colombia was different, but you had a similar opening. You had two parties previously who kind of had a deal with each other on governing, and they were both pretty corrupt, and that gradually broke down into the 90s, and then you had new people come in who weren't tied to those previous networks, those old patronage networks, in the same way, and they broke from them. So that created the opening for reforms, which had different flavor, but it's important because, you can't just say these. I don't know would these types of reforms work without that, say in an authoritarian state. There was a breakdown of previous political structures and patronage structures. But what was interesting, and again, this is slightly counter to what SSR doctrine talks about, was implementation was successful because of things like centralization. Now, SSR often talks about the need to actually decentralize, democratize, be inclusive. Whereas actually in Georgia and South Africa, they were quite centralized. So the Georgian, at a political level, the Georgian new government came in, reformed the constitution, not in a very perhaps rule of law way actually, but they centralized power. And that actually gave them some power over, say, local authorities and the various institutions to do stuff. And actually a similar thing happened in Colombia, with centralization of certain political bodies or increasing power to centralized bodies who would then have more power over, say, local government, which was often very, very corrupt. So on the one hand, you've got you need political openings to be able to create opportunities for reform, but you need a degree of centralization to be able to tackle the existing patronage
Yeah.
political networks.
Was the South African model also centralized, did you say? Or
No,
it was less centralized?
South Africa. I mean, one of the major reasons that we didn't see the same results in South Africa was they didn't focus on anti-corruption or organized
Mm,
crime in the same way. So, and to give you an example of that, I mean, they had first of all they had to change the demographics of the police because they were white South Africans, um, but they didn't do vetting in the same way. So, I've talked kind of broadly about the reforms, but one element of that is, you fire people and you vet them.
yeah, yeah.
And they didn't vet for. I mean, literally, one of the interviewees said we didn't vet for that. We vetted for things like human rights abuses, but we didn't vet for that. And there are other challenges as well. Like South Africa has had challenges to do with capacity and poverty. So police weren't really paid enough. But we didn't see that same. There was a degree of centralization after the in the transition, but not in the same way. I don't, to my knowledge.
Thank you, Liam, for that. And you're starting to touch on something that I also want to ask you a bit more about around assumptions that are challenged, and I will do that in a second. But here I have heard you say that, for example, the issue of centralization and decentralization, there might be some assumptions about what works that don't necessarily hold against the context. I'm just wondering, perhaps if we can just focus for 1 second on what you just said earlier. It sounds from what you have said that in both Colombia and Georgia, one of the key reasons for success was that the reforms were explicitly focused on tackling collusion, whereas in South Africa, this was not an explicit aim at all. So stating that as a goal was important. And I'm just wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about how Colombia and Georgia succeeded here, because obviously they presumably are going against very powerful interests domestically, very powerful actors who have, who have the means to do all sorts of things, right? So it might not necessarily be an easy thing for them to have done. And I'm wondering, aside from the fact that this was a great moment of political opportunity, the opening of the political opportunity structure, what compelled Colombia and Georgia to do this, even if it meant going against very powerful interests that presumably had infiltrated their systems?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there are two major factors, which one is there was popular pressure to do something, and the people involved wanted to do something. So let me start with the former. In Georgia, for example, the Rose Revolution was a rejection of the previous regime, which had been characterized by effectively state capture. And at a popular level, I mean, frankly, there was disgust about where Georgia was, and people had seen that corruption had sort of rotted out the system. Plus, they have a quite aggressive neighbor to the north, so in Russia. So the combination was sort of like corruption has really hollowed it out, and that created pressure to do something, to really kind of rebuild Georgia and re-establish Georgia. But also the new incumbents really felt that as well. So it's kind of like they felt the pressure to act, but they also really wanted to do that to rebuild the country. And in terms of like how do they tackle the kind of vested interest? Well, first of all, they had this popular backing, right? They just managed to kind of get over the previous regime. And one of the factors actually, the previous regime wasn't really that strong. It kind of acquiesced when you were in the face of the popular momentum. So that's what a factor why the whole kind of swathe of reforms went forward. The other thing is that they were very quick and actually quite assertive, perhaps even aggressive. So, for example, I mentioned these organized crime figures. Those were prominent figures in Georgian society. I mean, if you talk to someone from the Times, they'd say, if I had a problem, my car got stolen, I'd go to they called them the thieves-in-law. I wouldn't go to the police. And that's quite common. But what the Georgians did is they locked them up. They arrested them without really due process, really. And of course, they knew who they were because Georgia's a pretty small country. They put them all in one prison, isolated from their networks, took away their mobile phones, etc., etc. So they really cracked down on organised crime very, very quickly, which I think helped them be able to um, do their other reforms as well. And then similarly with collusion, they really targeted big pins, people from the former regime. Again, not necessarily following the rule of law, and there were some big questions about that as well. But it was quick and it was quite effective. Um, in Georgia and Colombia, you had a kind of some similarities. Like there was popular pressure to really act against this, well, infiltration of narco, the narco side of things, but also, of course, Colombia was undergoing a civil war. So, and there was kind of some overlap between them, the role of the paramilitaries, um, and the new reformers who came in. Their support was generally from more urban-based groups who wanted to, a rule of law. They wanted to have security. So that gave these reformers some degree of popular momentum to be able to tackle some of the changes, tackle some of the existing figures. So in slightly different, but some similarities with Georgia. So I think the combination is like I say, there's a popular pressure, and then the individuals involved really recognize and want to do it, and they can kind of use this to be able to do to be able to drive through what they wanted. The final thing is, of course, that it wasn't easy, of course, right? It wasn't easy. Georgia is
Yeah,
much
yeah.
more of a quick case, which is extremely rare. But in Colombia, it's we looked at things over a bigger time period. So it was two steps forward, one step back. So it was a kind of a bit
Yeah.
of a constant battle between reformers, and then there were scandals, and then went back, and then more reforms.
Thank you for that. And I think you sort of highlight a few things that are really important, including this issue of real tensions and dilemmas, actually, right? Because you're saying they're dealing with organized crime effectively, but at the expense of the rule of law, for example, in the case of Georgia. So, there are difficult trade offs and choices that have to be made there that are quite important. So, maybe picking up on that point, can you tell us a little bit about what kinds of assumptions that in particular international actors may hold when they do this work? What kinds of assumptions did your research really challenge or debunk, aside from this very important point on decentralization versus centralized ways of doing it, and also this issue about the rule of law? What other assumptions are challenged by the work that you have done?
Hmm. Well, so I have some experience in this area. So I was in the Foreign Office some years ago, kind of doing the work that a lot of donors do. Alongside this project, so we created a task force at RUSI. This was a SOCASE project run through RUSI, and the task force was comprised from people from FCDO, Dutch, German, NATO, EU, the US when it wasn't quite as bad as it is now, and other external experts and like myself. And the idea is because unfortunately, I know that policymakers don't have that much time to read, unfortunately. So we created this task force and had a couple of meetings. And the idea was first was like, why don't donors take corruption seriously in a lot of this work? And what was realistic in terms of addressing it. So, and the idea of that was, our case studies are actually what happened in countries. They're not case studies of externally driven reforms. And that's partly because we couldn't find really very many successful cases of that. But also, everyone talks about political will, but we actually needed to look at success cases and the various factors. But in terms of the key assumptions, well, one is corruption has been treated as a side issue, and it still often is. In fact, I won't mention the name, but a major donor said to me, yeah, we've largely ignored corruption for 20 years. And uh, I mean, I find that quite nonsensical, if I'm honest. So, but donor, and there are some good reasons why. Like, obviously, you can't just rock up to a country and say, you're all really, really corrupt. You have to work with people. But it's just not going to be effective. And also, you need to at least understand how things work before you can do what you want to do or try and get what you want to do. This The other things I think is SSR is really broad. Like it's generally tries, in theory, tries to do everything, and in practice does bits and bits and everything. But it's very value driven, and it's value driven at a quite idealized endpoint. So,
Mm,
we want everything. We want a functioning police force. It's got to be gender mainstreaming. It's got to be community policing, and there's a number of things that just don't really get enough attention. Corruption, but also spoilers, like people who undermine reform. That's a huge thing that isn't really considered enough. Is
mm,
that it's not because basically it's like it's almost talking like we're a happy family or
yeah.
with a few problems, like, oh, I'll help you, you do this, I'll do that. It's like, no, this toddler is just not going to do it. They are not going to play by the ball game, right? And we're talking about some pretty gnarly characters, so that's a huge thing. And then I suppose the final thing is that um, well, we talk about do no harm in a lot in international development, and I agree with that as a principle. But we're talking about coercive institutions, and actually, what the Georgians and Colombians did is they did a bit of harm to certain people to have success, right? I mean, they literally locked up organized criminals. They fired people. They arrested people, and it's not things that donors really want to engage with, and there were good reasons for
Yeah.
that too. But could you do those things without doing? Could you achieve success against deep integrated collusion, which involves a lot of violence, frankly, without doing those things? I think not. So I think that's one of the major assumptions that's often really not taken into account. It's like we're we're trying to do technical reforms without actually thinking of, well, actually, this is going to involve some quite potentially, it's going to involve coercive activity. Um,
Yeah, this is about all good things, right? They don't necessarily always go together hand in hand and reinforce each other in sort of positive ways. Very fair point. Tell us a little bit about what the implications from your research are for those who might be interested in promoting more effectively reforms to the security sector.
hmm. Um, I mean, like all good researchers, I'll add a caveat. Like these are two cases, and well, three cases, but two cases of success. But I think they're really important because they're success cases. And actually, we could do more. We could look at what Italy did, what Singapore did. But we have to be careful, right? Because if I'm saying we need to centralize, we need to tackle. I mean, this isn't exactly what I'm saying, but we need to be a bit careful around how we're engaging with coercive activity, particularly supporting some people to be coercive against others. Having said that, though, number one is take collusion seriously and corruption seriously. And I think donors just frankly haven't done that. It's not a side issue, it's a core issue, and it undermines everything else that they want to do. If donors want to tackle hybrid threats or counter terrorism or counter organized crime, you can't do that with a corrupt organized police or military. And you can't promote community policing or gender equality or good governance if that's happening. So you have to really understand that corruption is often the modus operandi of a police or military in such a country. So that's number one. In terms of what can be done about it, so I think actually anti-corruption probably has more lessons than a lot of SSR research and practice on SSR, but we're at a bit of an early stage, unfortunately. So because it hasn't really been that literature hasn't really been absorbed and applied to the security sector. What our research shows is that, well, there may be potential in really first having legislation that can actually be applied to anti-corruption and organized crime. Now, I mentioned that a bit earlier, but basically that the specific legislation made it easier to prosecute organized crime and the collusion aspects of it. And that's important. And the Americans did this in the 70s. They might need to do it again soon. So did the Italians. Um, because it makes it easier to, if you can't prosecute people, they will continue doing their activity. And it's not just like making it easier to charge people on conspiracy. They did things like plea bargaining and various things that just made it easier to tackle organized crime. But you obviously need to have capacity to apply that legislation. So another lesson is there's potential around creating these um, prosecutorial units which have capacity to investigate and prosecute collusion. And that, again, is really important because if you can't do that, reforms don't have teeth. And
Yeah.
countermeasures don't have teeth. The other bit is that you probably need to consider not just police or military reform, but the combination of that with these prosecutorial units. And again, it's that thing about, can reforms have teeth if you don't have that prosecutorial element? So let's say you just take a police force, a really corrupt police force, and you've got good reform leaders and maybe you do some purges, but there's no consequence for ongoing corruption. Then what's the point? So there may be something about that, having that combination. So those are all sort of some practical things, but I mean, we need to do more. We need to find out a bit more about how you could really get into the teeth of cleaning police organizations and military in these types of countries. Um, then of course there's the the politics, right? And that's harder to control and influence. I think the one thing to take away there is that donors really need to understand, obviously, the politics. Now I'm preaching to the converted here in the TWP community, but that still doesn't happen, particularly in security sector reform, because it depends which part of a donor system is doing it, right? Some bits are just going to do train and equip, train and equip, off we go, and it doesn't work. But I think we need to do a bit more than just a political economy analysis, right? So that's very good for giving a broad landscape, but you can do that in application to a security institution. You can quite like go and find out, and it doesn't take that much to go and find out, how do the police really work? What are they involved in organized crime? How corrupt are they? What types do they take? And you need to have that degree of understanding to be able to go, okay, what type of intervention it may or may not be effective. The final bit there may be also, don't do security sector reform, which I say with a bit of caveat because I often do consulting on security sector reform. But I
You're
think
biting the hand that feeds you. Careful.
yeah, I know, yeah. But like, we need to target. I think you'll have more traction by targeting our interventions to where they are likely to be effective than designing and thinking about the theory and the evidence. Everything's going to be played by the context and the politics, but really maybe then targeting on our intervention rather than saying, okay, we're in country X, what do we do? Maybe it's like, how can we best do whatever we want, improve security sectors, which countries are most conducive to it? I know that's not always going to be possible, but we should be able to better customize our interventions to at least to what's plausible, because the countries are different. Ukraine is very different to South Sudan.
Yeah, and I think this point about you're making about what is plausible and realistic in different contexts is essential. And I suspect this is not true only of the security sector, but more broadly of any kind of desire to promote change that is progressive. So thank you so much.
There's one more point on that actually, which I think often gets a bit ignored by is there's a big difference between fragile states and relatively stable but corrupt states.
Yeah,
And our countries were all middle-income countries. They had a degree
this is true.
of state control over their territories. A degree. Colombia maybe lesser, but but they weren't the South Sudans or the Yemens of the world.
No,
So
that's a very good point.
we
Yes, thank
really
you
do
for
need to, I think donors don't think enough about corruption, but just literal capacity is also something. A lot of countries, the state doesn't really exist outside the
yes, you
capital.
were not starting from that. Yeah.
Mm.
You're starting from more or less functioning states in all three. Thank you so much. This is all great. Before we leave, would you mind sharing with our audience one piece of advice or wisdom that you would like them to keep with them, please?
I want to scream take corruption seriously, but I'll do it in a different way. All right, imagine your country and imagine its darkest days. Would how could externally security sector reform work or contribute to that? So I'll give you an example. Imagine it's Belfast in 1980 and a Norwegian guy or gal comes out and wants to talk about community policing, and it's going to be there for a year, maybe two, doesn't speak English, and doesn't really understand the politics, right? How effective is that going to be? It's not. So, having said that, I don't want to be I'm not going to be too cynical about this. We can still do an awful lot of work, but you need to understand how things work, and understanding corruption, collusion, because often corruption is how things work. It's so fundamental. So maybe just having that frame of reference of like, and humility to think, okay, what do we need to know to be able to be effective? And realistically, what can we do? And I
Yeah.
think thinking of that through something that is your own frame of reference can help to really inject a bit more realism into what we want to do.
So your bit of advice or wisdom to our audience is think and work politically. I love it. Thank you so much. That's great. Thank
I
you,
was
Liam.
just wondering, because I think that sounds a little cynical, but I do believe in security sector reform, right? But and actually, I think it's not a very popular brand at the moment. Like, it's not, people, donors aren't talking about it in the same way, but it is important. And the thing is, like, a lot of the things that donors are talking about at the moment, or Western powers really, defense spending,
Yeah.
Ukraine, reconstruction, countering organized crime. You need to do a lot of the stuff that is in security sector reform. Hybrid threats is another one. And so there is a lot we can do to take the best lessons we have, but we really need to just inject more realism to be able to do that. So it's not just that we need to adapt security sector reform as it was, because frankly, a lot of it didn't work. But then, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So we need to take what is good and what is realistic and apply it not only to the contemporary hard security threats, but also to the things that people really need. Because the other thing is, a lot of populations are crying out for police that, aren't
Yeah.
robbing them, beating the hell out of them.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Liam, for your time. This has been very rich. And for those of you listening, you can also read Liam's blog and the report more broadly, as well as a policy brief. So thank you for that. And till next time.